Right. Okay. Let's make a start then. As I say, we'll have some question and answers at the end of the session. So we're going to just recap briefly on the causes and the significance of the Pilgrimage of Grace of 1536, which, as we know, was a major rebellion against the government of Henry VIII. And then we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking through the causes of the English Revolution. Okay, so I am going to give you guys just under a minute to fill in the year, what was the trigger, so the short-term cause that triggered the Pilgrimage of Grace, the leaders, what the key demands of the pilgrims were, and what factors underpin this rebellion. I'm going to give you just under a minute. Off we go. Okay, so the minute is just about up. You can fill in as we go along. So the year was, of course, 1536. Now, what was the trigger? Well, of course, and there was the clue in the image. It was the dissolution of the monasteries, the religious changes that Henry was rolling out. Of course, Robert Ashe was the main leader of the Northern rebels. The key demands, of course, was the restoration of the old ways of religion, the restoration of the monasteries, the removal of Thomas Cromwell from government, who was seen to be a very pernicious influence on Henry VIII. And of course, our factors, well, there's a variety of factors involved here, but I think we can say with some conviction that religion was a major factor. Obviously, the government that were driving those changes was a major factor, and of course, as were economic matters. We mustn't forget that a lot of the dissolution of the monasteries was economically driven. You know, it was a land grab. Henry wanted the land, he wanted the property, he wanted to sell it off. We know from the proceeds or the money he made, he built Hampton Court Palace. So the monasteries, of course, they were absolutely essential in the care of the poor. So there was a lot of economic factors mixed into the Pilgrimage of Grace as well. So obviously, we're not going to do the discussion now, but hopefully what you remember is that there's some real similarities in terms of the Pilgrimage of Grace compared to the Peasants' Revolt. In that, like in the Peasants' Revolt, when Richard appears to make all of these concessions to the demands of the peasants, obviously you might remember that once the rebellion became incredibly serious, it started with around 10,000 rebels in York. No, beg your pardon, in Lincoln, and then the rebellion had spread to York, where the rebels numbered some 30,000. Yes, it was a pilgrimage, it was a religious march. The rebels, of course, marched under the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ. Obviously, we call it the Pilgrimage of Grace because it was a religious rebellion, because, by and large, the rebels behaved in a very graceful way, but nevertheless, this was a significant rebellion. The Duke of Norfolk, of course, was tasked with, mobilising an army that could quell the rebellion. Now, Henry, of course, had to play for time. So, like Richard II and the Peasants' Revolt, he appears to sort of concede to some of the demands. He appears to, concede to the demands to call more parliaments, particularly in the north of the country. But in truth, he's really buying time. He even invites Robert Aske to Windsor for Christmas Day. But once the Duke of Norfolk has sufficiently sort of immobilised an army, it is the excuse he uses was that there were further kind of flashpoints of rebellion in the new year in 1537, which is Henry uses as an excuse to crush the rebellion once and for all. Robert Aske, if you remember, is hanged in chains, so it makes a quite grisly end. And really, what happens as a result of this is that the Henry's position is far more powerful. His power is far more secure than it was before the rebellion. And if anything, the rebellion has the opposite effect. It speeds up the process of religious change. So, in that respect, it was something of a disaster. Okay. Now, further developing this is that Henry, obviously, to tighten his control of the north of the country. Again, historically, this is an example of a northern rebellion. Going back to the times of William the Conqueror, the harrying in the north, there always seemed to be a rebellion in the north that monarchs were required to deal with. And so Henry, of course, creates a Council of the North. I guess we would call that in today's parlance a devolved assembly. And that was his way of strengthening his control over those northern counties. Okay, so in many ways, the rebellion is significant. It was a major rebellion against Henry VIII, but it was also a complete failure. Henry really emerges from this as a sort of as an absolute monarch with complete control over his subjects, and the religious changes, far from being halted, are actually sped up. So I have put in into this presentation a comparison question, comparing the Pilgrimage of Grace to the Peasants' Revolt. In this case, though, I have changed it to a question about differences. Now, we do need to be prepared for the example to give us differences rather than similarities. They did intimate at the very early stages of the spec that as the spec gets older, they may ask for differences. It doesn't matter. The technique is exactly the same. It's an examination of the causes. So instead of looking at similarities, can we see any differences in the causes? Looking at the methods used by the rebels, the key developments, can we see differences now instead of similarities? A fundamental difference, of course, between the Pilgrimage of Grace and the Peasants' Revolt is that the Peasants' Revolt was a very violent revolt. Even with the Archbishop of Canterbury was executed, heads literally rolled in London, whereas the Pilgrimage of Grace, it was by and large a fairly peaceful protest and demonstration. So there's a fundamental difference there. Outcomes, of course, obviously there's significant differences in the outcomes with regards to, whereas the Peasants' Revolt, yes, it failed in the short term like the Pilgrimage of Grace, but as we know, many of the peasants' demands were met in the century after the protest, whereas the opposite is true, of course, of the Pilgrimage of Grace, where Henry really tightened his control over the country. So that's something you could be doing as part of your wider preparation. So we are going to turn our attention now to the causes of the English Revolution. As you know, we are recording. If for whatever reason you get a text and you have to leave, okay, just put your hand up and quietly leave the classroom. Do you need to go? Perfect. Okay. And I'll come and move the chair, which is warning people that we are actually recording a lesson. Okay, so we're not going to have 5 minutes. We haven't got time. I'll give you just under a minute. No, just over a minute. Sorry. To think about now what were the causes of the English Revolution, the English Civil War. Let's see how much you can remember. And as you work through that, I want you to start to think about how do those causes relate to our stated factors. So which factors do we see at play in the English Revolution? How important was religion? How important was government? How important was the economy? How important was the role of the individual? How important was war? Okay, so let's go through that together and we can now compare notes. So I would argue that a major factor, a major cause of the English Revolution was, of course, government. Now, specifically, of course, as you might recall, Charles firmly believed in the divine right of kings. Now, this is, of course, the idea that the monarchs were chosen by God and could rule without being challenged. We are going to see in our study of Elizabeth, in the century before, the idea of this great chain of being, with obviously, the monarch was appointed by God. And Charles is still trying to sort of advocate for that. He's still clinging to that idea. So what happens is he refuses to share power. And he tries to govern without Parliament for a whole 11 years. He shuts Parliament down in 1629 and it's not recalled again until 1640. And this was known as a period of personal rule. Many MPs were very angry about this, who felt that this was an abuse of Charles's power. Now, when 5 MPs produced a list of grievances against him, known as the Grand Remonstrance, Charles, as depicted in the image there, he bursts into the House of Commons and tries to arrest 5 of those MPs. And that's the trigger that really sparked the English Civil War. So clearly, government is a major factor behind the English Revolution. Religion is also really important. Charles is suspected of, I guess, what we would call today mission creep. He was suspected of trying to slowly and incrementally restore Catholicism to England. Now, this was, again, many people saw this as a betrayal of the Elizabethan religious settlement, where England had been firmly established as a Protestant country. He made, there was, I guess, a concerted attempt to sort of like try to reintroduce some of the old ways back into our church and into our church services. So churches became sort of more decorative. A new prayer book was enforced. And it was when he tried to enforce those changes, particularly in Scotland, it sparked the bishops' wars. Now, it is that kind of commotion that breaks out in the Scottish church that necessitates Charles sending the army to Scotland to put it down, where they're roundly defeated. So we see war tucked into there as well. Okay, so Archbishop Laud was the archbishop who was seen to be kind of guilty of mission creep, trying to sort of restore the Catholic ways, and there was a suspicion around Charles himself because he was married to a Catholic. Economy was also a big factor. Now, a good example you can use for economy, of course, is the imposition of ship money. Now, you might remember that this was normally a tax only paid by people who lived in sort of coastal regions of the UK. Because obviously Parliament had been shut down and Charles was unable to use Parliament to raise money, he imposes ship money on most of the UK population. So it is incredibly unpopular. All right, so we got economy in there as well. Now, individuals, and this is where I think perhaps this is something we could have emphasised a little bit more in lessons. So individuals like John Pym, again, very influential MP, who helped organise resistance, and he was one of the leading MPs who presented the grand remonstrance to Charles, this list of grievances and criticisms. Okay, so we see individuals in there very, very importantly. Can I just ask for the students who are folding paper, you do need to listen very carefully, okay? Right. So we've got individuals. We've also got ideas. Now, we really see the ideas especially take hold during the events of the Civil War itself, particularly groups like the Levellers, who began to argue for a more equal society, the Diggers. Now, I guess looking back, we would see these groups as almost like early forms of socialism. Okay? And what they were advocating for, particularly for the soldiers who were fighting the war, but who still had no say in Parliament, they were really advocating for the extension of the vote. An issue that doesn't really pick up for another few centuries. So, what you can start to do as part of your revision is, having looked at these factors now, and again, start to come to a judgment. What factor kind of really stands out here? If we had to have a hierarchy of causes, hierarchy of factors, do we see one factor perhaps as more important than another, or are they kind of interlocked? Is there a real interplay, going on around them? But I would still say, for me, I think government stands out as particularly important. This was really a power struggle between Parliament and Charles. This was really an argument over how should the country be governed. Should it still be governed solely by a monarch, or should it really be? Is Parliament now emerging as sort of the supreme sort of legal body? And of course, what comes out of all of this, not just the initial revolution, but the later revolution known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which was against Charles's son, James II, after the Restoration, so long after the interregnum of Cromwell, we see the Bill of Rights, which finally settles where power lays. And of course, today, we have parliamentary sovereignty. Now the monarch is more of a figurehead. So for me, that's now government definitely stands out, as I think, for me, as perhaps the most important factor here. Okay, religion was important, as was economic matters, but I think they kind of amplified sort of the real issue, which was this struggle between Charles and Parliament. That's my judgment. That might not necessarily be yours. So what you can start to do, and I'm going to give you the rest of this revision lesson to do that. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I would like you in 2p paragraphs, please, to explain the causes of the English Revolution. So 2 factors, please. Choose the 2 factors that you think stand out as the most important, and turn that into a fully developed P paragraph, okay? End, if you can, with a judgment. Why do you feel that this factor is more important and weighs more heavily than, say, some of the other factors? We will come back to looking at the consequences later on. But before I hand over to you guys, obviously there are some very important consequences of the English Revolution. 1649, we all know what happens. Charles is found guilty of treason and he is executed. The monarchy is abolished. The House of Lords is abolished. And we enter into what's known as the interregnum, with Cromwell as Lord Protector. Okay? But that's not the end of the story, because we know in 1660 the monarchy was restored under Charles's son, Charles II. And then we have, in 1688, the Glorious Revolution, where Parliament once more, this time enlisting the help of William of Orange, deposes Charles's son, James II. And that leads to the constitutional settlement known as the Bill of Rights, which finally settles the the debate as to where legal supremacy lies. And today, of course, we have parliamentary sovereignty. Parliament is the supreme decision-making body, not the monarchy. So there's some really, really important consequences that come out of this. It is extremely significant, and we will also prepare for a significance question in a future revision lesson. Okay. So I'm going to stop the recording now. You're going to get into at least one P paragraph by the time you leave this revision lesson, hopefully two. Start with the factor that you feel is the strongest. Point, evidence, explain. Use connectives to link your evidence to the question. This was important because this shows that. Okay? And that way then you'll have an answer that is explicit rather than implicit. And I'll take some questions from you in the next 15 minutes. So we're going to stop there for today in terms of the recording. Okay?